Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in after lunch to be here at the first session of this afternoon's conference. My name is Rory Miller. I'm a professor of government here at Georgetown University in Doha, Qatar, and I will be moderating today's event. I just want to start off by introducing briefly the four panelists. As you'll notice, there's four panelists rather than five in this session, so there will be extra time for questions if you so wish. Our first speaker today is Professor Jeffrey Anderson. He is the Graf Goltz Professor and Director of the BMW Center for German and European Studies in the School of Foreign Service. And he's also known to many of us here as faculty chair on main campus, in which position he deals with us extensively, and it has been a very big support. His research and writing covers European integration, domestic European politics, and of course, given his topic today, a special focus on Germany. And he's actually written a book on German reunification. Our second speaker today will be Birol Başkan. He is an assistant professor of government here at Georgetown in Qatar. Previously, before coming to Georgetown, he was a professor at Qatar University. And his research, again, as evidenced by his topic today, examines the roles of religion, religious institutions, and even grassroots religious movements in domestic Middle Eastern politics, again, in part with a special focus on Turkey. Our third speaker today, and it's a real privilege to have her here, is Professor Gwendolyn Mikell, Professor of Anthropology at the School of Foreign Service in Washington. In her time in Georgetown, she has served as Director of the African Studies Program and Chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Her main areas of research include African politics and economics, democratization and peace, feminism in Africa, and also the religious dynamics of African organizations with an emphasis on women. She has many achievements to her name, both in service to the university and service to the field. Among them, she's a board member of the Smithsonian Museum of African Art. She's the author of two books, one, Cocoa and Chaos in Ghana, and she is currently working on, which again is drawn on in her presentation today, on a book on Kofi Annan's role in Africa. And our fourth speaker today is my office neighbor down the corridor here, Patricia Reynaud. Educated in Paris and in the United States, she's taught in the University of Miami extensively prior to coming here to Doha. Her research interests include French sociology of culture, the influence of India on French philosophy and literature, French and Francophone literature, and film studies, among other things. And this is reflected in the wide range of journals in various disciplines that she has published in. Most recently, she's the editor of a volume called The Question of Evil, Interdisciplinary Approaches, that was published just last year. Okay, so that is my job done in briefly introducing them. There are more detailed biographies in the website of the conference, but I think all I need to do now is call our first speaker, Professor Jeffrey Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. It's a great pleasure to be here, and especially a pleasure to be here talking about things other than faculty governance. So thank you for the opportunity. I want to make sure I can see the clock so I don't go over. Yes, I can. So, Germany. We Germanists are quite fond of anniversaries and celebrating anniversaries, and as you know, over the last 6 months or so and heading into this coming year, we're in high season for big anniversaries. The 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall occurred this past November, and this coming October, we'll have the 25th anniversary of unification. And these two major events, these two major anniversaries bracket a time for reflecting on the seismic changes that have occurred, not just in Europe, but also in the international system writ large. And this is a wonderful opportunity to talk about a central actor in this saga, 25 years ago, the Federal Republic of Germany. And in particular, the way in which Germany exercises power in the international system. And what I'd like to focus on here is the interplay between domestic changes that have occurred in Germany and international behavior. But first, we have to think about history. It's hard not to think about Germany without reflecting back on more distant pasts. There's, of course, a well-established tradition in academia as well as in politics that seeks to look at history as a guide to the future, the past as a template for the future. And students of German politics and history are certainly no strangers to this manner of thinking. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, Germany's past was put into play, often quite vigorously, to shed light on what people thought would be Germany's near and distant future, and by extension, Europe's near and distant future. And in particular, harkening back to the German question, and this cartoon that you see here plays on those themes. The question, of course, at the time in 1989 was which past would be the guide to Germany's future? Would it be the Weimar Republic, Germany's abortive attempt at democracy between 1919 and 1933? More prevalent, would it be the horrible years between 1933 and 1945 that saw Germany descend into insanity and drag Europe into the abyss along with it? Or would it be a more recent past, Germany's successful transition to democracy after 1945 and the 40 years of stability and prosperity that had ensued? In short, Germany, like any country, has multiple pasts, each of which illuminates the question of, in this case, German power in a very distinct way. And in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall and well into the 1990s, Germany's more distant pasts were called on and called up as templates for thinking about German power and German and European futures. The first, as I hinted at earlier, Weimar. There are not a few observers at the time in 1989, 1990 expected to see democracy weaken very quickly in a united Germany, as it had between 1919 and 1933, and expected the resulting political, economic, and social upheaval accompanying unification to spill over into the rest of Europe. In other words, here Germany's power was viewed as a negative power, the power to destabilize and disrupt through failure. There was also a strong argument made that looked to, as I mentioned, the period 1933 to 1945, that is looking very carefully for the seeds of an independent and most probably aggressive foreign policy in the geopolitical upheaval accompanying unification after 1990. Worries about return to form, that is, attempts by Germany to rebuild its co-prosperity sphere in Central and Eastern Europe, to tilt away from the West. And these next two cartoons get at that. Here we have François Mitterrand answering the door, behind which stands a German Frankenstein, presumably. And this is going to disrupt the kind of cozy retirement Europe that's gathered in front of the television in the other room. You can see the NATO sign on the back of the wall as well. Let's see if I can make this way. There we go. This one casts its lens a bit more broadly. Not so much concerns here about a German tilt away from the West, but rather a German drive for neutrality, right? A non-alignment that German unification would mean essentially disengaging from the international community. And here's Hans-Dietrich Genscher trying to reassure everyone that this behemoth would actually behave itself. And these questions, I think, were quite prevalent in the media. Not a few academics were participating in this. I can remember an article by John Mearsheimer predicting Germany would reach for nuclear weapons within a very short period of time after unifying. These questions, these templates, I should say, generated a lot of passionate debates, but I think they all suffered from a major flaw that limited their capacity to help us understand what would eventually happen in post-Cold War Germany and post-Cold War Europe. That is, they treated these 4 decades after the end of World War II as a kind of period of historical remission, in which underlying German traits went to sleep for a period of time only to be reawakened by unification. German history here is a kind of inexorable cycle of repetition, of negative or evil repetition. And in some ways, my research starting in that latter part of the 1980s was about trying to understand why this was not happening and, in fact, not likely to happen. I've taken 3 cuts at this over the years, first in 1990, then toward the end of the decade in 2000, and now more recently looking at Germany's German foreign policy in an era of ISIS and Ukraine, among other things. And I think it's fair to say that although German democracy has changed, Germany is still a democracy, but its democracy has transformed in many ways since 1990. Its foreign policy is distinctive, is different from what obtained before 1990. And a lot of these changes can be traced directly back to the impact of unification. The fact remains that the dominant motif here is one of continuity, of stability and approach. That is, these 40 years of democracy, economic prosperity, and multilateral foreign policy have left, I think, a lasting imprint on this country and more specifically on its elites and on its citizens. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that in the next 15 minutes or so. I keep pulling up the wrong thing here. This is a book I published with my colleague Eric Langenbacher 5 years ago on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of all these momentous events. So I first took up, oops, that's getting a little ahead of myself. I first took up these issues back in 1990 in a piece that I co-authored with John Goodman, who at the time was an assistant professor in the Harvard Business School. And we wanted to try to get a sense of what was happening in Germany at the end of 1989-90, that is, talk to elites and try to get a sense of how they were thinking about these dramatic changes that were occurring not only domestically, but more importantly in Europe and in the international system. And we went in expecting to find very little actual change in foreign policy. I mean, months after a major upheaval, you're not likely to find dramatic changes in policy direction. But what you might find are changes in the lenses that elites are using to understand the world around them, questioning of assumptions, longstanding assumptions about foreign policy. And the baseline that we were working from was this distinctive approach that Germany had in the post-war period to its foreign policy. And these were characterized really by 2 principles. One was reflexive or reflexive or exaggerated multilateralism. That is, despite its size, despite its economic power, German foreign policy was very much about embedding itself in international institutions like NATO, like the European Community, and seeking to achieve national interests through multilateral engagement. And the other principle was, for lack of a better term, a decidedly postmodern approach to sovereignty. That is, Germany, really uniquely among all medium to large size European states, was quite willing to give up its sovereignty, to pool sovereignty at the European level in particular in order to achieve not just its own national goals, but multilateral or collective goals in Europe. It was a big state that behaved very much like a small state, like one of these smaller Nordic states. And what we found after an extensive period of interviewing, particularly of foreign policy, but also international economic elites, was a huge degree of policy continuity in terms of outlook and approach. That German foreign policy, at least for a large, powerful nation state like itself, was still going to approach foreign policy making with this distinctive bent of multilateralism and the pooling of sovereignty. There was no evidence whatsoever that we uncovered of any reassessment of the wisdom of membership in organizations like NATO or the European Community. We uncovered a lot of evidence that suggested that far from being the result of a rational instrumental calculation, that is, German policymakers deciding that the benefits of membership in NATO and EC outweighed the costs of remaining in it, and certainly were preferable to exiting. In fact, these kinds of cost calculations were nowhere present in the responses of our interview subjects. It was as if membership in these organizations had become ingrained in the very definition of national interest, which was fascinating. If you were to interview, or if we had interviewed British or French foreign policymakers, I'm sure we would have heard a very different story, a much more instrumental narrative about membership, and that was completely absent in Germany. In fact, the questions that Germans were asking themselves at this time was not whether to stay in NATO or leave it, whether to stay in the European Community or leave it. It was rather, how can we adjust these international organizations to take account of the new realities in Europe? So again, the premise was to stay embedded in international organizations. And our modest forecast at the time was that, yes, German foreign policy would probably start to exhibit more self-conscious ruminating about national interests, but that it would still stay confined, contained, embedded, integrated within these larger institutional structures. Now, flash forward a decade to 2000 when, and I won't bore you with the citations, but I took another crack at this question of German foreign policy. This decade was certainly not a quiet period on the domestic front in Germany. There was growing economic frustration in Western Germany, feelings of betrayal in Eastern Germany. The Chancellor Kohl in 1989 promised flowering economic landscapes within a short period of time. Nothing like that had emerged by the end of the decade. There was a lot of concern about the viability of the German economic model. Germany was regularly described by both outside observers and internal experts as the sick man of Europe. None of this really had any kind of demonstrable impact, though, on German foreign policy. In other words, if we think about that Weimar parallel, not even close to having ripple effects at the international level for Germany. And during this decade, Germany took some dramatic steps, particularly when it comes to its military security policy, to become a more prominent, a more active, a more proactive actor in Europe, player in Europe, if you will. But again, remaining within these international memberships. So power through partnership, which is the title of this talk, remained the leitmotif of German foreign policy. That said, there were new accents. There was a greater willingness to debate European integration, the merits of European integration. Put another way, European issues became the subject of political contestation within Germany, and this was not unique to Germany. All throughout Europe, starting in the 1990s, the European integration question became politicized, and Germany certainly shared in that trend. There was a greater attention paid to the bottom line in Brussels. Germans were much less willing to write checks to solve problems, and that actually had a braking effect on European integration. So in that sense, European integration really tracked closely Germany's willingness to push integration, and because Germans were a little more cautious about integration slowed during the 1990s. Germans were much more cautious about enlargement throughout the course of the 1990s, largely because of financial concerns. Put it in its broadest sense, there was a greater sense of the limits of European integration in German political discourse. No more starry-eyed talk about a United States of Europe, very much a desire, I think, to achieve and maintain a status quo, an equilibrium in terms of integration and state sovereignty on the other hand. Now, so if we want to describe this as a normalization of German foreign policy, then why not? Germany was in many ways behaving much more like the larger powers in Europe at this time, but it was still a distinctive approach. Unlike the British, unlike the French, when German foreign policymakers undertook an initiative, the reflex was to work with and through these supranational and international organizations. Finally, and I'll wrap up here, the period since 2010, quite dramatic changes on the domestic politics level. The German party system is transformed. We're now talking about a completed shift from a 3-party system to a 5+ party system, with now significant anti-European party activity in the form of the Alternative for Germany. There's a continuing weakening of the great coalition partners, the center left and center right. Although the German economy has made, at least relative to other countries in Europe, a pretty significant recovery, there's still deep concerns about the viability of Modell Deutschland in a globalizing international economy. And we have also concerns at the domestic level. These are reflected in the broader crisis in Europe, economic crisis in Europe that began in 2008, 2009. And here again, it would be possible to go into way too much detail here and take way too much time, but if you step back and think about how the Germans have approached the solution to these problems at the European level, the Eurozone crisis, the response has been not to withdraw, not to disengage, not to go its own way, but rather to strengthen European rule frameworks in order to address the problems and as a result achieve German interests. So here again, just as in the past prior to 1989, Germany sought to create a rule framework at the European level that resonated with and amplified its own domestic economic requirements. We can think of the same strategy being employed today after the financial crisis. And so in that regard, although Germany is a much more muscular player in Europe, it is much more willing to advance its national interests or to publicize its national interests as compared to the pre-1989 period. The primary vehicle remains these intricate and complex international organizations of which it's been a part for now going on 60 years. And I would just, I'll conclude on the subject of security policy. Since 1990, Germany has, or I should say German elites have conducted a thoroughgoing discussion within the country about the need for Germany to take on a greater role in terms of the provision of military security. We've seen that was galvanized with the Balkan crises in the 1990s. It's been an uneven progression since then. You can think of Germany's response to the first Gulf conflict, staying out largely, writing checks, becoming more involved, obviously, in Afghanistan, withdrawing on Libya, staying on the sidelines, but now fully engaged and leading a coalition in Europe when it comes to dealing with the crisis in Syria and Iraq with ISIS, but also Eastern Ukraine. This power through partnership motif, although it's still understated on the security side relative to Germany's economic and political might, is something that is paying huge dividends for the Western alliance. I can assure you the Obama administration is grateful for not only Germany's willingness to be a partner, but its willingness to bring its partners in Europe along with. I'll close there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have, but thank you for your attention. I look forward to the other presentations.
I am very pleased and honored to be part of this conference and this panel. The question that led to this research that I'm going to talk about began to evolve in the last 3 years. Prior to that, honestly, I really didn't think about it. And the event really which gave the spark happened December 2013, when a couple of really brave state prosecutors charged tens of individuals, businessmen, who are very close to Prime Minister, or at that time, but President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, involving in massive corruption and fraud. To the point that one of the individuals who was charged or accused was Erdogan's own son, Bilal. Erdogan's reaction to the investigation was, many times he repeated his position. He saw it as an international plot. So I am going to quote from one of his speeches he delivered in one of the cities. He said that the trap is the court investigation. The trap laid last week is a dirty trap disguised as a corruption operation, but planned abroad and executed by local collaborators. My nation is not and will not be deceived by this. My nation, I have no concern, will give the necessary answer to these on March 30th. March 30th was the date of the upcoming municipal elections. And then he said that on that day, to these gangs and their masters, this nation will give a harsh response. On March 30th, not interest rate lobbies, war lobbies, barons and gangs, but the nation will triumph. This anecdote is telling. And it's not exceptional, by the way. If Erdogan makes speeches almost every day, and not just one time, a couple of times. And in almost all of his speeches, this emphasis on the nation is to the point of, you become really tired of the word after a certain thing. But I guess the anecdote and this and the similar ones is telling in how the term nation acquired such a significance of almost fetishistic proportion in Erdogan's political rhetoric. And more interestingly for me, because this fetishism with the term can be observed in his heart constituency, which are the Turkey's Islamists. The obvious question is here how this fetishism with the nation, the word nation, captivated Turkey's Islamists, who are, by the way, generally we thought that against the idea of the nation because of its secular European connotations. There is a related and much more subtle issue here, I guess, is that what is it that really mean when they say the nation? These two questions that are driving my research, and which is not complete, by the way, and I don't think that I can complete in a short time. What I have done is that I gone through some Islamist newspapers and then picked 3 prominent Islamists and then read all of their columns and see their reactions to the December 17th corruption investigation, how they interpreted, how they constructed this event, what that event signified to them. And from that construction of the events in their mind, in their imaginations, I tried to construct an imagination, how the Islamists imagine the term nation, what do really they mean by the term the nation. So I look at all the columns written by these 3 prominent Islamists between December 17, 2013 and 30 March 2014. And I am sure, because I am following their columns regularly, if you look at their reaction, for example, to the military coup in Egypt, for example, it's almost same. We have a similar narrative lingering through all of their accounts. So what I have found, they have differences, of course, but they share a pretty striking similarity in terms of what's happening in Turkey and in the region regarding the 17 December corruption investigation. And if you look at their constructions, their narratives, you also see that they have a pretty similar understanding of the term, the nation. So what is that view? What is that imagination? I'm not talking about ideology here. I am talking about what you really imagine, what really come to their mind when they say nation, when they say this or that. So it is less than, it's like a Charles Taylor social imaginary term, if you are aware of it. That's not a really ideology, but more like a less coherent set of assumptions that you have about the... So according to this view, there are extremely powerful international actors, and these international actors try to control and exploit the Muslims in Turkey and other Muslim countries. They do this not directly, but in collaboration with local powers. Especially Turkey has to be carefully controlled because it is the only Muslim country which can break this hegemonic exploitative relation. So Turkey has this special place in the Islamic world. The Islamists view themselves, so to speak, using the Leninist term, vanguards, who are to enlighten masses and the people about this exploitative world system and mobilize the masses against it. And the people here, it is really equivalent to the nation, but it is not about the Turks, it's not about the Kurds, it's not about the Arabs, it's the whole Muslim community. So here, when they say the nation, it's more like a cover-up of the term, really the ummah, which is a negative connotation in the Turkish political culture. So they really avoid using the ummah, but with the nation, with what they call millet, is really the ummah. So these people appear in their imagination, this is very critical, to be innocent, inherently, naturally innocent, naive. So they need a patriarchal guidance, otherwise these people can be deceived and manipulated by some treacherous forces. Despite their nativity though, the Islamists hold, the people have this sort of folk wisdom or instincts to figure out who are their saviors and then who will support them if given an opportunity. And of course, this is the act of voting in democratic state. So this is the Islamist obsession with the ballot box. They put so much trust in the ballot box because they have this trust in the people that once they are given the opportunity, once they are given the correct information, they are going to pick the Islamists all the time. Well, I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, but I'm just saying this is how they believe. So people here imagine to be instinctively religious, even though they might be incorrectly practicing religion. So, aware of all of this, international powers are aware of this, of course. So, and their collaborators, their local collaborators, constantly seek ways to keep the Islamist and Islamist movements under control and ally the opinion of the masses unfavorably towards the Islamists. So, there you have. We have the 17 December scandal, which is a plot by the international powers to undermine the popularity of an Islamist government, and they are using, of course, their local collaborators. And as I said before, if you read the Islamist reaction to the military coup in Egypt, for example, which is, by the way, which happened like a 5 or month before the corruption, it's exactly the same theme, same imagination running through their writings. So, how many times? You have 12 minutes. 12 minutes, okay, good. So what's the question here? What I'm trying to do in the second part, after I hope this was persuasive to the reader, I mean, you might disagree with that description of the imagination. I guess what I'm trying to do, or what I am going to try to do in the future research, is that can we really trace the genealogy of this imagination? Of course, this is an ongoing project, it's not complete, and there are many and wide gaps in my own understanding too. For example, definitely if you read the whole reading, you are going to see a very strong presence of Marxist analysis. Word system analysis in particular, and also dependency school, very much linger into their analysis of the hegemonic world system around them. It is there, and then I guess it still has to be clearly spelled out how the Marxist analysis enter into the Islamist reading of the world system. Of course, here, vanguardism, Lenin's theory of vanguard party is so obvious, and also, if you know Sayyid Wali Nasr's work on Abu Ala Mawdidi, he also makes the same case that he really understands the Islamist party as a kind of a vanguard party who is going to lead the Muslims towards the bright future. But what I am emphasizing here is that I think there is a much wider and much deeper impact of the Marxist analysis on the Islamist thinking, which waits future research to be uncovered. There is also a strong, I mean, this is really weird because Marxism and postmodernism are very much related, but they also conflict with each other because one is, in my opinion, positivist, and the other is not really positivist. But in the Islamists, we have this weird combination of postmodernism and Marxism in their analysis too. There is also this postmodern analysis of the world too, which I believe still waits for research. So I cannot. So what I'm going to say is, in terms of genealogy of that imagination, I'm not going to say that what I'm going to say is complete. But what I can say is that there's some remarks that I am going to make about the genealogy of this idea that the people are innocent or instinctively religious. So we can trust in their folk wisdom. We can trust in their choices. I guess how this idea developed in the Islamist imagination, that's what I mean by tracing the genealogy of the. So I am going to make some remarks in the remaining 7 to 8 minutes. So Islamism originated in the Turkish setting in the late Ottoman period when the so-called young Ottomans wanted to defend the constitutional monarchy on the religious grounds. Beyond that, they also sought ways to persuade their reader that how Islam is relevant to modern life. Because the newly developing secular ideology was making the claim that Islam is going to be unnecessary for modernity. So this idea of making sure that, or persuading that Islam is relevant to modernity has been there from the very beginning. For example, one idea they put forward, and then later on it remained very strong in Islamist thinking, is that Islam was a powerful social bond that could survive to unite as one nation, otherwise quite diverse people. So in other words, Islam could be used to construct the nation. But the nation is not the secular nation here. A nation is a group of people who are bonded together through religious ideas. So hence, Islam could serve as the basis of the political community. This is, you can see this in the writings of the late Ottoman Islamists, for example, very, very frequently, like from all over. To prove their point, if you look at the Islamist discursive strategy, to prove their point, the Islamists argued that Islam had deeply penetrated and shaped the cultures of different Muslim peoples. The implication was that, and of course there is no empirical proof for that, and this is a problem for the secularization theory too. There is no empirical proof that the medieval people were more religious than the modern man. But here, by making a claim regarding the nature of Islam and its place in the people, they were implicitly assuming that people are, by their nature, religious and instinctive, of course. And of course, this became a traditional Islamist response that you cannot, Islam or religion is going to be relevant for people's life forever. So this view of the people as instinctively naturally religious has survived to this day. In the writings of the Islamists of the later, the idea appears in different forms. Again, this Islamist idea of using religion as a kind of a unifying bond among different, appears over and over again, which is used to delegitimate, for example, the secular national idea. And also others more secular ideologies like Turkishness, for example. Of course, here I should note that in the early Ottoman or late Ottoman Islamists, there is this idea of Salafism too. In another word, there are bid'ah, there are innovations in Islam, and then we should get rid of them. There is a very strong Salafi dimension in that thinking too. But that dimension was lost in the Turkish case because of a particular political circumstances. If you know the Turkish history, we have Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who basically secularization reform really meant the dominance of Islamist narrative in Turkey. So the Islamists in response developed this idea that Mustafa Kemal was an atheist or anti-Islam, anti-religious. But at the same time, they developed this strategy that if we introduce this questioning of the fundamentals of religion from a Salafi perspective, this is going to help Mustafa Kemal Atatürk to undermine religion. So the prominent Islamist Said Nursi, for example, said that, okay, we can open the gates of ijtihad, but it is better we should not. Because once the gates of ijtihad are open, then we cannot stop it. So this strategy, which is really developed in response to the Mustafa Kemal's secularizing reform, really added to the Turkish Islamism a very strong conservative element. That let's not question the hadith, let's not question anything about Islam too. So this conservatism survived, and with that conservatism, of course, added to it is this idea of the people as naturally or by their nature, by creation, people are natural added to the contemporary imagination of, again, when it evolved into today, it became a fetishistic notion that the people are good, people are naive, people can be trusted, so that we can go to the ballot box and then we can trust the ballot box. How? 2 minutes. Okay. Now, I have a lot to say. So what I am going to do is I'm not going to trace the journey further, but I guess those elements gave this Turkish nationalism the necessary tools of seeing the nation and later on acceptance of democracy made it much more easier for the Turkish Islamists to accept the ballot box as an arbiter because of their trust, deep trust in the religiosity of the people. And if they are informed, they are going to make the right decision. So this research, is this why it is important? Well, I mean, if it is not important for anything, that's okay. I mean, it's just intellectual curiosity of a lonely and bored academic, you can see. But I guess today's Turkey foreign policy, I guess, for example, cannot be really understood if you really don't know this fetishism of the idea of the nation, and then what that nation is really about. That nation, as I said, is a cover-up for the Ummah. I guess you really cannot understand the Turkish foreign policy followed by the current Turkish government. But also, what is important, I believe, is that this perception, this imagination of the global system, the local collaborators, international powers, innocent people, I guess shows the limit of Islamist democracy project. I guess with this idea, I guess you cannot really go beyond Rousseauian democracy or beyond 19th century democracy, which is really the majoritarian rule. No respect for minorities, no respect for the liberal rights and freedoms that are seen essential in the liberal democracy. Thank you.
Very much. I'm really pleased to be here. It's been an exciting day, and it's been wonderful for me to return to Doha and to the School of Foreign Service here. I'm going to be talking about Kofi Annan, transforming the exercise of power in Africa. I'm going to do that very much as a political and economic anthropologist looking at the subject. When I first started working on this, my approach came as a little bit of a surprise to some of the people that I was talking to. They did not think that Kofi Annan was going to be a transformative force. They did not expect that he was going to have Africa at the core of center of his interests. They were convinced, many of them, many of the Africanists looking at him, were convinced that he would be a toady of the United States because of the support for him from the U.S. They were a bit angered by the fact that Boutros Ghali had not served 2 terms and that Kofi Annan was going to represent Africa in a way they didn't want Africa to be represented. And so it came as quite a surprise to them. I embarked on this project because it was becoming clear to me that a surprise had begun to unfold, and that the surprise was going to deepen the longer he was in office, and then deepen even as he left office. So I began to work on this project in 2006, about 6 months before the end of his term. And I began to interview a lot of the people who were a part of the United Nations, people who represented many of the African countries, people who were in NGOs that had dealt with the issues that Kofi Annan's initiatives related to, and to look at civil society groups and interview many of them. Out of it came some of the points that you see here, and I'm arguing that he had an opportunity to correct some of the errors in how the UN had dealt with Africa. He had a perception of Africa as having enormous possibilities, political possibilities, economic possibilities, that were not able to be achieved given problems in governance, given problems in the way in which the state was exercising control. And so he set about doing many of the things that, trying to transform many of the things I've outlined here. Competitive multi-party elections, altering control over civil society so that citizens could actually speak out, contributing to economic and development and peace, human rights, the rule of law, constitution, this was a big one, constitutional term limits of office holders, and the transfer of power from one elected leader to the next elected leader. He was determined to create a transformation that would move power holders, state power holders, limit them, and then move them from the scene so that the public would become accustomed to this kind of democratic transition. Why? Why was he so focused on this? Many people argue that he was focused on this because of Rwanda. We'll remember that in 1994, the Rwandan genocide happened while he was head of DPKO, Department of Peacekeeping Operations. And he was castigated for not having, thrown down the gauntlet and threatened to resign if they didn't move troops in to stop the genocide. He did not. And in my interviewing with him, it was very interesting to listen to his impassioned, it was the one thing that he got very upset about, his impassioned defense of why he could not do what the Africanist community and what the world would have wanted him to do. I am combining my background in field work and in the methodologies that anthropologists use with theoretical perspectives on this. with policy discussions that I've engaged in over the years. I've had an opportunity to, at the Council on Foreign Relations, do what I call dialogue sessions with many of the African leaders. And out of all of this has come some very interesting perspectives, which I'll share with you as I move through this. And so I'm going to be looking also at the way in which Kofi Annan interfaced with those African leaders that he was so intent on influencing, and the perspectives that they had on an organization like the UN. I am interested in how these processes, the processes of how African countries and African leaders dealt with international organizations, with the world writ large, how they were different from what took place in the early independence period. And looking at the ways in which Kofi Annan made a contribution to a radical shift in those relationships. Then I'm going to talk about what he couldn't change, because obviously there was a lot he couldn't change, and what future leaders might do. Ghana, Nigeria, and Sudan are case examples that I'm going to keep referring to here, and it's because I've done work in many of these places, not direct work in Sudan, but work in many parts of the continent, focusing on West in particular, because Kofi Annan thought there was something happening in West Africa that was a lesson for the rest of the continent, and so I'll be focusing on some of that. He had spent time in Ghana when it was under military rule. He was working in the Ministry of Tourism, and he was disillusioned with the inability to do the kinds of work that he thought would link Africa to the global community in a more productive fashion. And so he went back to the UN deeply disillusioned about military rule. He thought that Ghana was not doing something it could do, which was be a leader in the West African area. He saw West Africa as an ideally integrated area. I'll talk about that a little more deeply. He knew that a lot of the integration, current integration, was as a result of the way in which West African states in ECOWAS, the regional organization, the way in which they dealt with each other. But he understood that West African societies had also been deeply interrelated before the colonial period. And so I'm looking at something as I was doing the research. I was looking also at something which had existed prior to colonialism. And what I was looking at was the placement of those societies, West African societies he was so focused on. Where did they fall along something that I called a socio-political continuum? This is of my own construction, but it's something that anthropologists would understand clearly. And that is that there were societies in West Africa that were state organized, that had organized each one of them different places in Ghana and Senegal, in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, and in Cote d'Ivoire, but state societies that had organized political systems, that had managed economies and infrastructure and all of that, and that those societies were better positioned to deal with not only the diversity of people, but to deal with what I call diversity within their societies and tensions that might arise from it. So what I've done, don't know how to use this. Let's see if I will discover. I'll just let you look at it. What I've done is to say those societies on the extreme right of your screen there had the ability to, am I getting it? I'll leave it alone. Had the ability to manage those relationships better, and therefore had the possibility of remaining cohesive states. You'll see ones like Sudan and DRC, kind of in the middle there. There are others that I could add to that. I could add, Liberia and Sierra Leone, but I'd rather put them after Botswana, further down by Angola, South Africa. Those were societies that were, quote, state organized for reasons that were external to the continent because of African Americans and returnees coming in and creating a hierarchical and oppressive state. So what I'm essentially saying then is that the possibilities for moving in a democratic direction were there and acknowledged by many Africans because they didn't think that what had existed before was so radically different in West Africa from what one might call popular representation. The diversity that I was talking about is important for us to focus on because most of the societies of sub-Saharan Africa, most of them are highly diverse. And what I'm trying to show you with this map is that although you can see that most of those countries from the north all the way down to the sub-Saharan ones were societies that, although 90-odd% Muslim, had a strong focus on participation of the majority of everyone in the society. And so Islam had been predominantly, moderate throughout many of these areas. And so Kofi Annan is Secretary General at a time when the moderate Islam that had existed in the past was being altered by many conditions internal to the continent as well as external. That's a larger discussion that I won't spend too much time on here, except to say that Kofi Annan was familiar with tolerant Islam and thought that democracy would move you back to a period of that. During his tenure, Kofi Annan then was focusing on problems that some of whose origins lay far in the past, and, as I'm going to indicate, some of which came from the recent period. So we had a tendency to think of those newly independent states as being strong and having a possibility to move forward. Kofi Annan had discovered from his experiences in Ghana and many other parts of Africa that it was an illusion, that many of those countries had weak infrastructure, and that the collapse that we were observing in the 70s and 80s was not something that was mystifying, that the structures could not have sustained themselves for very long. And so he is looking at periods in which different impacts are taking place on these states. In the 1990s through 2000, the vacuum left by the movement of many of the Western societies out created space, new space, for what I've called ethnic entrepreneurs. And those are the people who moved in to grab control of the state and to say, there's no way you're going to get any of the goodies that the state has if you don't back me, your ethnic leader, usually it was ethnic rather than religious. From 2000 onward, the growing civil society protests. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. I'm going to move quickly through this. And then 2008 is another period when increasing economic crisis brings schisms within the state. So Kofi Annan's focus, some of his initiatives were clearly focused on dealing with economic governance. He was mainly out to transform this because he understood the links between economic governance and political governance. And if he was going to transform headquarters, focusing on macroeconomic priorities, he was also going to insist that the Africans dealt with it. And so many of my interviews were with people who were in the Bretton Woods institutions, people who participated in the kinds of discussions that Kofi Annan set in motion, people who supported the institutional transformations that he was trying to achieve. K.Y. Mwako, who had worked in the World Bank, oversaw these big table talks, and they brought together all of the ministers of finance and foreign affairs, together with the UN people, World Bank, IMF, all of that. And many of the African presidents, as you might imagine, said, "Stop this, why are you doing it? You're messing with our affairs." And they were indicating by that Kofi Annan had no right to interfere with what they saw as the sovereign policy and control within a sovereign state. But out of those big table talks came something important, and that was NEPAD, the new Partnership for African Development. And that made a major impact on the way in which those societies were dealing with each other as they designed economic plans. And so literally, he was pushing them, kicking and screaming, toward working together economically. On political progress, he was very clear that many of the conflicts that were taking place within the continent, and wars raged during the 80s, end of the 80s, but during the 90s, wars raged. And so most of the things he was talking about were also about bringing an end to these conflicts by pulling economics together to ask why are these conflicts taking place and beginning to resolve some of that, and then by pushing leaders toward. I know I have only 1 or 2 more minutes. And so he was essentially saying the United Nations didn't do all of the peacekeeping it should have done. The Africans did it. The Nigerians, the Ghanaians, they did it. They intervened and brought about. And that means that it can happen in many other places. If Zimbabwe, he agonized about Zimbabwe. If Zimbabwe was in West Africa, they would have, all of those problems would have been resolved. One of the things we saw then was a continuation of this movement toward democratization, and institutions put in place, the APRMs, the African Peer Review mechanisms put in place, so that those who were engaged in greater transparency and governance could become the models to say, look at us, we're willing to be reviewed by a larger community. Question, if in all of those things he did, if he had that impact in transformation, does it mean that it would continue? And my argument is yes. Is there a problem with that? There are lots of things that we could argue about that. But it looks as if the Africans have claimed and owned many of those policies he was pushing down their throats, so that they begin now to design ways to implement it within the state, within the continent, within the African Union. That whole focus on United States of Africa. No, it can't be done, but we see them moving slowly in that direction. Peacekeeping, Nigeria, Ghana, yes, but now they're training others to participate in that. You have now in Ghana, the case of Ghana, a fourth transition. Nigeria is the problem for us because of what we're seeing now with Boko Haram. That tolerant Islam now is being challenged. And what you're looking at with Boko Haram leads us to ask, is there any possibility of that tolerant Islam returning if there is not a global working together with African countries for that? Let me skip Sudan. There are other Sudanese experts here. Will his legacy last? That's the problem for us. We've got to look more closely at these kinds of things. We've got to ask questions about it, but we are not the only ones. The African states are asking those kinds of questions and looking for answers to them. I haven't had time to talk about all of the interviews and the people. Many of the comments I'm making come directly from their mouths. And so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will make a detour through literature. In a book published in 1961 entitled Ambiguous Adventure, Cheikh Hamidou Kane, a Senegalese author, was already writing about the interaction between Western and African culture through higher education. The hero of his celebrated classic, Samba Diallo, goes to study philosophy at the Sorbonne. He gradually loses touch with his Islamic faith and roots. Nearly 50 years later, Moshin Hamid's novel, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, introduces his narrator, Cengiz, an 18-year-old Pakistani, who narrates his own story of his love-hate relationship with America. He attends Princeton on a scholarship and immerses himself in the elitist student culture of the East Coast academia. Exceedingly bright and highly motivated, upon graduation he is recruited by the best valuation firm, Underwood Sampson, to be trained as a financial analyst. He excels in his job. The first novel has a lot in common with its 2007 counterpart, and the trajectories of the two respective heroes soon become a difficult quest for identity. Hamidou Kane is often quoted for a sentence which stresses the ambiguity foreign students are faced with when country-to-country relationships of power are at stake. Diallo is sent to the white man's university to, I quote, learn from them the art of conquering without being in the right, end of quote. Cengiz reappropriates this statement in a different socio-economic and political context in the 21st century in a post-colonial and globalized world. To be in the right, at least at the beginning, means to master the fundamentals of finance and apply them, this fundamental of the market economy, having, of course, real power and concrete consequences on the people they affect. Juan Bautista, a deus ex machina and the manager of a publishing company in Chile, will subsequently play the part of an agent of subversion. He will make Cengiz rethink his allegiance to the fundamentals of neoliberalism. The US educational system is presented as pragmatic, effective, meritocratic, and ruthless as well, all qualities related to the art of conquering. Cengiz's training lies in determining the value of business client of his firm plan to acquire, offering a profit projection with the utmost precision. Underwood Sampson are generous corporate employers to their selected few and proud analysts. It is difficult, especially for a trainee with a poor background like Cengiz, not to be corrupted by easy money made available through travel accounts, first class, of course, hefty bonuses and other rewards. The neoliberal doxa he immediately endorses. despite his Pakistani habitus, is presented as an affirmation of the philosophy of instant gratification combined with professionalism, the two underlying the US material success, the two sustaining the law of maximum returns. The management rhetoric pervades this text, personified by Jim, his boss, a man of caliber and of similar background who takes Cengiz under his wing. These ideological discourses, simple and effective because of their simplistic turn, make trainee empowered and self-confident. They emphasize adaptability, flexibility, tolerance, and diversity, with no time left to dissect the underpinning reality for which they all work hard, a rather somber reality that Juan Bautista will later unveil. The idealization of competitiveness combined with the warrior ethics could lead in the long run to a neo-Darwinist world. Here again, it would be quite productive to make reference to Bourdieu's last book, Acts of Resistance Against the Tyranny of the Market. The sociologist offers a devastating critique of the Washington Consensus. Hamid's novel provides the typical beginning of a coming-of-age story, reminiscent of Balzac in his series on the human comedy. But this 19th century comedy is turning into a real tragedy 2 centuries later. In Le Père Goriot, Eugène de Rastignac advances through women in a post-revolutionary France and climbs the social ladder from a student of noble but poor extraction when the book starts. A parvenu, he proclaims at the very end of the novel while overlooking Paris. À nous deux maintenant, it's between you and me now, another famous statement not unlike Cengiz in New York City, who felt, I quote, based in the warm sense of accomplishment. Nothing troubled me, he adds, I quote, I was a New Yorker with the city at my feet, end of quote. To be fair, Cengiz feels many moments of guilt and shame, but for the wrong reason, it appears, that of not really belonging to the rich world, blind that he is, and lamenting over the gone wealth of his own family, a wealth lost to social climbers in Pakistan, like the one he has turned into in New York City. He suffers from misrecognition or allodoxia, a mistake, I quote, that arrives in the course of the movement from one national field to another, from one territorially bound framework of opinion and custom to another, which characterizes intellectual exchange in a globalized world, end of quote. During the last 30 years, the philosophy embraced by neoliberalism has permeated discourses as well as institutions. Summarized in one word, it is defined by change, endless change without stability or anchoring. Interestingly, the name Cengiz is translated by let's change in the French language. Power comes from becoming change, I quote, asserts Jim. The reader intuits a society made of networks and transient loose relationships through project, organized and then dissolved as soon as one comes to an end. However, a life without stability can prove inhumane. Jim's imperative to focus on the fundamentals become the guiding principle of economics, which mandate a single attention to financial details, end of quote. With these parodic calls to the fundamentals, a reference to the French philosopher René Guénon may not be out of place. In the reign of quantity, 1945, Guénon formulated a severe critique of the modern world, which later proved prophetical on many respects. While he is seemingly rethinking the old and conventional critique of a materialistic modernity, the originality of his book comes rather from seeing the triumph of materialism and its values in all its forms, including capitalism, as a very transitory phase within a more global process. Guénon's analysis prefigured the neoliberal phase of trans-ideological capitalism we have known since the 80s. For Guénon, modernity develops and reduces the qualitative point of view to the quantitative one. This is accompanied by a movement of acceleration of temporality and of a reduction of space whose effects are quite visible today in expressions such as the world is flat, the world is a small village. It brings about a cosmos in which individuals are mere indifferentiated monads, a world of uniformity, the parody of a true unity. The neoliberal discourse on the global village has paradoxically contributed to exacerbate identity politics and conflicts. Guénon distinguishes two phases in the process, the first corresponding to the triumph of materialism and the second to its dissolution. Thus, it seems legitimate to analyze neoliberalism as a radical and aberrant form of classical liberalism, which correspond precisely to the passage from a materialistic capitalism, when search for sources of profit is still linked to objective variables, real investment, real competencies of managers, a Fordist type of work organization which still grants stability to the old structure, to a capitalism of flux where the dematerialization of money and dissolution of structure into a post-Fordist reticular environment has led to mere speculation and speculative investment and returns based on projections which themselves depend on the fluctuating variable integrated in the financial models used. Perhaps the turn could have taken place when the Bretton Woods system was dismantled in 1971, when the US unilaterally terminated the convertibility of the US dollar to gold, making the dollar free-floating. For free-floating is the very word which characterizes our economic and social world, but the term is distorted and mimicked in the media as a positive flexibility, all the more desired that more flexibility is said to bring more progress, when the reverse is often true, especially from a social point of view. When no center anchors or hold the system together, when no organizing principle is found, any referent disappears. In its place, only an evanescent fluidity of networks remains, an opaque maya, Guénon would add. In the final phase of dissolution, change is valorized for its own sake. The discourse of neoliberalism seems to be a perfect expression of this dangerous fascination for change at all costs, which can only lead to more and more economic meltdowns like the one the world faced in 2008. Of course, the novel insists on two types of fundamentalism, two sides of the same coin, the neoliberal power and the religious one, acting as a counter-power, no less a distortion of truth than the first one. Homologically, the Bretton Woods of religion are the September 11 attacks, the collapse of the Twin Towers of New York City's World Trade Center. If Chenge's first reaction is to smile despicably, It is because of the symbolism of the attack, I quote, the fact that someone had so visibly brought America to her knees. End of quote. The book conflates the religious and the political, the religious and the economic. What could be a better target than to attack the American empire from its core values, commerce and the market economy in its face of dissolution? Neoliberalism and the terrorist response to global capitalism can be interpreted as the twin aspect of the development of the reign of quantity beyond the stage represented by classical capitalism, but also beyond major political ideologies in the 20th century, such as nationalism and fascism. Instead of making the individual freer or restoring the holistic dimension of his life, they both increase the local and global disorder. They are objective allies in the process of dissolution that characterizes post-modernity. Okay, so I won't talk about the second assignment in New Jersey, even though I just will say that Chenge still observed the financial details, but he noticed some disturbing signs because his credo, neoliberalism, has some adverse consequences on other people's lives and on the workers that his precise calculation, will make redundant. And what's interesting is that when he has to return to his country after September 11, and when he returns, the most local, that's his hometown, impacts directly on the seductive global assumption he has espoused so far, namely that a free market means freedom and brings more democracy. So another significant deterioration occurs in the relationship with his troubled girlfriend Erica. It is also dissolving into another type of chaos, and Erica is placed in an institution. She is losing touch with reality, content to live in her mind and memories. In this gradual disconnection, and conversely to reconnect with Guénon on the topic of modernity, her reality gets fractured. So a parallel can be drawn between two love stories. Chenge's with Erica and Chenge's with America. The two are based on a shared love, be it a romantic one or the attractive fundamentals of finance. Both are collapsing as the novel unravels and reveals fractures at work within the imaginary world, love and the free market, love of the free market, and all the more reassuring that they are constructs. This world are based respectively on the idea of intimacy and progress that can never be had. When one approaches them, they recede into a distant future, thus revealing the futility of attainment of happiness through love or through material possessions. With respect to their personal trajectory, which follow the country's neoliberal trajectory by a clever mise en abîme, our anti-hero, now he has become an anti-hero, and Erica are both confronted to an emblematic manifestation of counterfeiting in the dissolution phase of postmodernity. Erica's mental state is but the reflection of a social disorder surrounding her, and her institution, far from healing her, leads her to a presumed suicide. On Chenge's side, the second temptation he experiences to react against the materialistic disorder of the West is another form of parody, religious fundamentalism, all the more dangerous that it is a posturing of a real spiritual tradition. So now I'm going to conclude with the last and third valuation project in Chile, which confirms the death of his love for America, as well as the concomitant fictitious death of Erica. He fails to achieve his assignment, is led off by Underwood Sampson, price to pay to become free from the lure and illusion of the West, and he sometimes plans, although he denies it, to destroy the evil empires from outside, from Pakistan, now that he knows so well its weaknesses from inside, from 4 years spent in America. He has finally internalized the validity of Hamidou Kane's proposition, quoted earlier, but he has turned it upside down in a gesture he is not fully conscious of. Cengiz has successfully learned from the US the art of conquering with being in the right, so he believes, resubmersing himself into the century-old tradition of his family custom, which, all things considered, he finds better than any foreign borrowings. Of course, the reader is well aware of the neoliberal curse. He has been contaminated by American values he has become so critical of. So then, you know, the book, he starts working in a university, as a university lecturer in Lahore, and is very popular among his students, and of course he teaches courses on finance, but is also turned into nationalistic Pakistani, and of course his philosophy is dangerously fraught with American core capitalistic values. So I'm not going to talk about the Janissary because I don't have the time. And I will conclude. The moment of realization that the American dream was just that, a dream, is quite forceful. He is confronted with the reluctant manager in Santiago de Chile, reluctant because he manages a publishing company, symbolically representing the qualitative pole of in the social world and not the micro-universe of valuation self-contained unto itself. Juan Bautista is a reader of books in this capacity. He asks, in the manner of a Zen question or koan, intending to exhaust the analytic mind, what do you know about books? James fails in his answers and remains stuck in his quantitative certainties. I specialize in the media industry. I value a dozen publishers over 2 decades. Juan Bautista is right to retort. That is finance. The question is asked a second time, and Cengiz replies, approaching the truth. My father's uncle was a poet. He's well known in the Punjab. Books are loved in my families. A statement that catches the attention of the South American and neo-spiritual awakener. To evaluate a publishing firm is considering the larger picture and absurdity, consisting in the incommensurability between quality and quantity, symbolic capital and economic capital, and this absurdity imposes itself on Cengiz. He makes an attempt to start on a new path, of course. And so in a way, if we conclude, books are the substance that convince Cengiz to reevaluate the valuation business, and the specific books from his great uncle happen to be a poetry book, emphasizing once again that when the most local in us is touched, generalization about globalization don't stand a chance. What is most dear to people seem to be who they know, their immediate surroundings, and not the disincarnate concepts of the market, self-enclosed theories like neoliberalism that have an history within time and certainly will die.